Welcome to the online training program by Prevention Works, formerly known as CASEC. My name is Trish Whetstone, and I am the Prevention Education Coordinator out of Prevention Works South County office here in Jamestown. I've been with this organization, formerly known as CASEC, since 2016. I got my Bachelor of Science in Psychology with a minor in Public Health from SUNY Fredonia, and I have a couple of professional trainings under my belt. The first one I ever did was actually with my colleague here with me today, Eric Williams. We did a training on Google Drive, as well as a training entitled The Talk, which was on current drug trends. I have also some experience with a stress management training on children living in a chemically dependent home, training on electronic nicotine delivery systems, and one called Hidden in Plain Sight, which is about hidden drug paraphernalia.
Hi, my name is Eric Williams. I am the Prevention Education Coordinator out of the North County in Dunkirk. I've been with Prevention Works for a couple years, since 2017. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in social work with a minor in sociology from SUNY Fredonia. And as Trish said previously, we've been in a couple professional trainings together, such as our Google Drive training, The Talk, which we talked about current drug trends. I've also done trainings with children living in a chemically dependent home on electronic nicotine delivery systems, our Hidden in Plain Sight training, and I am also a youth mental health first aid instructor. So today's online training is called Marijuana and Adolescent Brain Development. And here are some of our objectives for today. We're going to review different components of marijuana and how marijuana has changed over a period of time. We'll discuss the neural and behavioral risks associated with adolescent marijuana use. And then lastly, we'll summarize two types of addiction and its impact on the adolescent brain development.
So marijuana is a substance that can sometimes be a little confusing. There's a lot of information that we get from the media or the news, and throughout our culture, it's becoming increasingly legalized across the country. That results in a lot of misinformation surrounding this substance, that it is always okay as a medicine and maybe that it's completely safe. Today we're going to go over some of the information based on extensive research regarding marijuana, based on tests that have taken place over a long period of time with many populations, not just our opinion on this substance and not just what maybe people hear from their own personal experience, but fact-based research. So marijuana comes from the Cannabis sativa plant, and it's sometimes just referred to as cannabis, or in slang terms, maybe weed, pot, or grass. But what we're really going to focus on is the different components of the plant. Our main focus is going to be on Tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, which is the main component that we're concerned about because it causes the high and it affects adolescent brain development. We will first get a little bit into CBD, or Cannabidiol, and the effects of that, its use or potential uses in medicine. We also just want to go over the fact that there are other components to the plant, such as hemp, which isn't a drug that changes our brain activity, but it's used in lotions and protein powders and bracelets and all sorts of things. It's just another part of the plant that has been utilized in our culture, again, not as a drug, but in a different way. CBD and THC are just two cannabinoids that we know a little bit about. There are actually hundreds of cannabinoids in the marijuana plant, or the cannabis plant, but we're mainly going to focus on those two for today. So we'll talk about CBD first, or cannabidiol. Like I said before, it's one of just hundreds of cannabinoids found in marijuana, but it does not cause that high. It doesn't affect the adolescent brain, so it's not as much of a concern as far as it being used recreationally. It's actually almost always used as a medicine, and it does show some medical promise for helping alleviate pain and anxiety and epilepsy, just to name a few. There's actually the most support, or the most promise from research showing that it can help with seizures. Some people do say that it can help with pain and anxiety, but what we found for some people is that over time it can actually increase that pain and anxiety. And we don't really know why that is. We don't know if people are using the wrong dosages, if they're using it too much or too little, if just certain people shouldn't use CBD. So that brings us to our main point on CBD, is that its use and effectiveness is still being researched. There just isn't enough research to know whether or not it's completely safe or to really understand all the possible risks of this substance. So if we think about how CBD is advertised, it's kind of advertised like the end-all be-all drug, like we can see in some of these advertisements, that it's pure, it's natural, it's revolutionary healing, it'll make you feel like you again. It's advertised for everything from acne to anxiety to things like a runny nose. And what we know is it probably isn't the end-all be-all. It's probably not going to help with all of those issues. But that's kind of what we see in our culture nowadays. So we just tell people to take caution because, again, we just don't know the long-term effects. If we think about how medicine is done safely, it's usually in pill form, and there's usually information on dosages and warnings, and we just don't really fully see that with CBD yet. So if you were to have a headache and I said, here you go, chew on the bark of the willow tree whenever you have a headache and you'll feel better, you would kind of be like, what the heck? But that's where we got aspirin from. But we've taken that component out and we've put it in a pill form with information on when to take it, the dosages, warnings, interactions with other drugs and substances, so that you know how to take aspirin safely. That's really where we should be with CBD, rather than just getting it and using it and saying, you know what, I'll use this whenever I have a little bit of anxiety or pain, I'll just take a couple drops here and there. That's really kind of a risky way to think about medicine. Another thing we'll say is that it's kind of being sold everywhere. It can be sold in like honey. In our community here in Jamestown, New York, it's sold at our family video store, which is kind of weird. We probably shouldn't get medicine from the guy who rents us videos, right? And lastly, one of the points that we'll bring up is that THC can be found in CBD. We know that in our state up to 0.03% THC can be found in CBD. And as Eric talks about THC, even a little bit can be risky. People can and have failed drug tests from using CBD oil because there's that little bit of THC present, and even that little bit is risky.
So now let's get into the conversation about THC, or Tetrahydrocannabinol. This is the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. This ingredient in recreational marijuana causes that high feeling. So we're really going to focus on this component of marijuana because of the way it affects the healthy brain development of the adolescents. One thing that is not really known amongst users is that the brain doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. So it's about 25 for females and up to 28 for males. The basic action of THC in the brain is that it reduces or slows down communication between the cells. It's actually a depressant in brain function. So think of THC as like a storm. Okay, and your brain cells, think of them as two cell phones. And I don't know if you've ever tried making a phone call or sending a text message while there was a storm going on, but when that storm is happening, sometimes it's a bit more difficult for that message to be sent to the other line. And that's what THC does in the brain. It makes it harder for your brain cells to communicate to each other when that THC is present. So we'll look at some of the different functions of the brain that are impaired because of the use of THC. So if we take a look at these two images here, it represents two teenage brains, with the one on the left being the healthy brain and the one on the right being the brain damaged by marijuana use, more specifically THC. The host actually represents the areas of the brain with reduced activities from THC rather than less brain matter. So sometimes there's this myth that, when someone smokes marijuana, then they kill brain cells, but there's actually not research enough or a lot of research out there about THC killing brain cells, but there is substantial research out there that does say that it reduces the brain activity. What this 3D scan is showing is a lack of blood flow within those areas of the brain. Because of the lack of blood flow, those areas aren't working as efficiently as compared to the healthy teenage brain that we see on the left side. Studies has shown that the last part of the brain that develops is the frontal lobe. What that means is for every adolescent, that part of the brain is not fully developed. And since the frontal lobe controls our decision making, memory, communication, among other functions, the adolescents may be more prone to have those permanent impairments in this area. While some of these changes can be permanent because of the development, some may just be while THC is in the system. In just a few slides, we'll actually talk about how long it can stay in our system. Here's a quick little video that is shown from the perspective of an adolescent. It's actually a great summary on how our decisions affect our brain wiring, especially when you're young.
As teens, people are always telling us what we can't do. Do you ever wonder why that is? Why can't I stay up late? What could happen if I just play for 15 more minutes? Who cares if I smoke a joint every now and then? Let's face it, adults may mean well, but they can't really explain why they won't let us do this stuff. The thing is, there's actually a really cool explanation, and it has to do with our brains. From the outside, the brain of a newborn looks just like a smaller version of an adult brain, but there's a big difference. There's a ton of stuff that still needs to be programmed into a young person's brain. That's where our life experiences come in. How we interact with what's around us shapes our brains until we're in our mid-20s. We can't feel our brains changing, but they are super busy building circuits and programming. So how does this happen? Every little thing that happens to us can change our brain in huge ways. At short distances, our experiences can make or break connections between brain cells. By guiding the creation of circuits, experiences shape our perceptions, memories, and everything that makes us unique. But they also affect our brain across longer distances. This involves the construction of thick bundles of fibers that connect different brain regions. By creating this complex network, experiences help increase the brain's bandwidth, allowing it to work better and better. But you gotta keep in mind, these short and long-range connections are influenced by everything we do and everything that happens to us. But this is awesome news. It means we are the programmers of our brains. Every decision, good or bad, influences how our brain develops. Let's talk about taking drugs. For example, pretend this is the keyboard you are using to program your brain. Using drugs just for fun or to get high would be like scrambling the letters on the keyboard. Now, if you scramble the letters on the keyboard after the program is written, that can lead to temporary errors or make it hard for the program to run for a while. But if you scramble the letters while the program is being written, the program can incorporate catastrophic, long-lasting glitches. This is why teens are better off without drugs. We are in the middle of coding our brains, and drugs can cause real problems that can last a long time. And yet, drugs are just one of the many possible ways of scrambling our keyboards. For example, not enough sleep, lack of exercise, or eating too much junk food can also harm our brain programs. So yeah, I get it. It's annoying to be told what we can and can't do, but I would rather focus on my ability to shape my brain through smarter decisions. It turns out we have far more control than we thought. We can use this information to choose our own paths and give ourselves the best possible futures.
Again, this is a great video that really talks about how our decisions, or how an adolescent's decision to use a substance at a young age while their brain is still developing can have some major effects in the future. So take a look at this image. It shows the locations of cannabinoid receptors in the brain. THC attaches to the cannabinoid receptors within the brain and changes the action of the brain structure. Just take a look at a few. In high levels, THC can affect our amygdala, which functions to regulate our emotions, fear, and anxiety. When THC is interfering with the amygdala, it can cause panic and even paranoia. The brainstem regulates information between the brain and spinal cord, so when THC is present, it causes anti-nausea effects. One FDA-approved drug called Marinol is used for cancer patients to help with relieving some of the nausea associated with chemotherapy. Now, this is an example of that form of marijuana that has THC, and it's being regulated in pill form, and it's not really being smoked. It went through rigorous testing to ensure the benefits outweigh the risk. Referring back to what was mentioned in the beginning of this training, this specific example of Marinol is what can make the drug of marijuana so confusing to adults and especially to adolescents. When you hear information regarding medical marijuana that can be beneficial to some people, there might be a generalization that this drug in any form isn't risky, and that's just not true. In the previous slide, we looked at how THC affects some parts of the brain. Now we will look at how that changes our behavior and lifestyle. Another infographic found on NIDA, which actually is where we got the previous video from, gives specific examples of how marijuana may hurt the developing brain. This infographic shows that using THC while the brain is developing can have long-term effects on education, income, and satisfaction with life. Studies show that adolescents who use recreational marijuana are less likely to graduate from high school, as well as enroll in college, which may be linked to greater chances of being unemployed and earning lower incomes in the future. This can be because THC affects our thinking in the neocortex, our memory in the hippocampus, as well as our motivation in the nucleus accumbens, all of which is very important when pursuing higher education.
Marijuana is really an interesting substance because it has quite a few unique properties, or ways that it's kind of different from a lot of other drugs. One of the ways that it is very unique is that it is a fat-soluble substance. So most drugs, like alcohol and cocaine, for example, are water-soluble. Since our bodies are mostly water, this means those drugs wear off after just a few hours. We probably know that example of about 1 drink of alcohol per hour is kind of let out of our system. But with marijuana, it actually stays within the fatty lining of certain cells within our body. These cells are found in our brain and our reproductive organs, and they stay there for a long period of time. Depending on how much somebody uses or how frequently they use or the concentration of THC in the product that they're using, marijuana can actually stay in the system for days, weeks, or even months in people that use frequently or daily. So there are actually many occurrences of failed drug tests. Some of the clients that we work with have failed drug tests even 3 months after they stopped using. And I want to just reiterate what I said before about CBD. Even if you're not using recreational marijuana, but you might be using another component like CBD, it can have some THC. That process in which it's taken out isn't always the greatest, most cleanest, consistent process, and we have known some people to fail a drug test when they were just using CBD. Now, when the high wears off, somebody won't appear high anymore, or it won't seem like the drug is impairing their system, but because it stays in the system, it'll still be affecting their brain and the functions of their brain. So again, they won't really appear high, but it still has that effect because it stays within the synapses between our brain cells and within the lining around those cells. So that results in that impaired messaging between brain cells. It's a depressant on our brain cell function, like Eric mentioned earlier. And because we saw all those different areas of the brain that it affects, it can result in some really serious consequences over time. We don't like to perpetuate stereotypes here at Prevention Works, but if we think of that stereotype of kind of a pothead or a stoner who kind of just doesn't want to do anything but smoke marijuana, there's actually a diagnosable condition for that now, and it's called amotivational syndrome. Because of the way it affects that nucleus accumbens and our amygdala, we can actually have such impaired motivation that we don't really want to do anything but maybe use that drug. We also know that it impairs our concentration, which can affect those long-term outcomes with our education or work, as Eric mentioned, and it can also affect our depth perception. So the ability to see how far or close away something is, which is really, really important when we're driving. So if we see a stop sign or a car ahead of us, for example, and we're under the influence of marijuana, we might not realize how close or far away it is. We could run a stop sign, we could have a fender bender with someone in front of us. So it's really important to know that driving under the influence of marijuana because of the way it slows down our brain cells, slows down that reaction time, impairs that depth perception. It's really just as risky as driving under the influence of alcohol. Lastly, there is some research showing that continued use or daily use of marijuana can result in cognitive decline or lower IQ over time, especially with those young users. So if our brain is still in that really pivotal point of development in our adolescent years, in our early 20s, and then we have a substance that is staying within the brain over time, it can affect our cognition. And because of the way that we can't concentrate as well, we don't have as good of memory, we found that users have scored lower on IQ tests over time compared to those who didn't use marijuana and compared to before they used. Another way in which marijuana is quite unique is that it is both a stimulant and a depressant drug. Most drugs are either a stimulant, like caffeine or nicotine, or a depressant, like alcohol or heroin, that slows us down. But marijuana actually has properties of both. As we mentioned quite a few times, it does slow down, decrease our neural messaging, so in that way it's a depressant on our brain function, but it does actually stimulate our heart rate in a very similar way as something like nicotine or cocaine. So it can actually increase our heart rate quite a bit, and we'll see that based on that concentration of THC, that increased heart rate could result in increased panic, attacks, anxiety, and some other heart issues with people who use frequently. Now, these properties as a stimulant or depressant can depend on the strain of marijuana or the strain of the substance. Two common strains are indica, which acts like more of a depressant, and sativa, which acts more like a stimulant. As you can see within this advertisement, it shows that if you are looking for a more relaxing effect, maybe to help you sleep, you might choose indica, and if you're looking to something to help with your energy or to use throughout the day to stay focused, you might choose sativa. But what we want to let users know is that this isn't always black and white like this. It might not always work this way for everybody. Everybody's body is incredibly unique. We all respond to drugs differently. So even if you go to a shop and they say that this indica will work for you because maybe it worked for them or their friend in this certain way, it just might be very different for you. So we tell people to take caution with this. There's also hybrids of strains that can have properties of both. And again, in states that this is legalized, we'll see more advertisements like this. But this is really our first example of some of the ways that marijuana is advertised in a way that promotes mostly the benefits or positive effects of using these strains without really showing the possible risks. So, for example, if you constantly use indica to help you fall asleep, over time, you might have issues falling asleep without it. It might become your crutch and you might really become reliant on it, which isn't the greatest thing. Or, for example, if you continue to use sativa, you might have some that increased panic, anxiety, or heart issues because it's constantly too energizing or stimulating for your body. Lastly, I'll just say that the potency of the strain can really affect this as well. So the potency refers to how much THC is in this strain, and we're going to look at really the reasons why potency or amount of THC is super important. So when we're talking about the potency of a strain of marijuana, for example, we're talking about how much THC it has. And THC levels have changed drastically over time. So back in the 1960s, when smoking marijuana and marijuana use first really became popular in general culture, the average plant contained only about 3% THC. Now today, in the United States, on average, the plant contains about 15 to 20% THC. Data from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration shows that back in 1995, it was only about 4% THC. So this shift is really quite recent. In 2014, the average plant had about 12% THC, and in 2017, it was all the way up to 17.1% THC. Now, what happened around this time? It started being legalized, right? And so as it was legalized recreationally and medicinally, the amount of THC has been genetically modified to increase or be larger in these plants. So this shift over the last 25 years actually exhibits over a 300% increase in the THC level. there are some really serious implications to this, and we'll get into that in the next couple of slides. But what we want to know is that concentrations, extracts, edibles, and hash oils, which again we'll get into, really have the highest levels of THC, 20 to 99%, and these really are the most risky products, even more so than the plant that might be smoked. Now, that doesn't mean that marijuana in smoked form is safe or safer than smoking other things. That actually isn't true at all. Anything that we inhale or smoke can be very damaging to our lung tissue, which is really fragile. So even if we were to roll up lettuce and smoke it, it wouldn't be safe and healthy for our lungs. But sometimes there's that thought that maybe smoking marijuana is a little bit safer than smoking something like tobacco, and that just isn't true. Now, when we smoke maybe a joint of marijuana, compared to if we were smoking a tobacco cigarette, we use a deeper inhalation, and we usually inhale for a prolonged period of time. We maybe smoke to a shorter butt length, and it is burned at a higher combustion temperature. So all of this combined results in actually 5 times the amount of carbon monoxide concentration, 3 times more tar, which stays and collects in our respiratory tract, and higher levels of ammonia and hydrogen cyanide. So this study from the University of Washington's Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute really showed that smoking marijuana is just as bad as smoking tobacco, and if we were to smoke it as frequently as tobacco, it would actually probably be worse for our whole respiratory system. Now, most people don't smoke as many joints per day as they might smoke a whole pack of cigarettes, but regardless, marijuana in the smoked form or any drug in the smoked form is very, very risky and damaging to our health. So we know that marijuana in the smoked form is very risky, can result in lung infections, more coughs and colds and other illnesses, especially within our respiratory system. So sometimes people say, well, edibles must be fine then, right? If I consume it like that, it's not going to hurt my lungs or my throat or any of those processes or important parts of our body. But unfortunately, edibles pose their own risk. So when we smoke something, it actually travels through our lung tissue to our brain within seconds, and within just a few short minutes we feel that high, we experience the effect of that drug super quick. When we eat a drug or we consume it, it actually does not travel through our body quickly. That route of administration has to go through our whole digestive tract and break down, and it isn't processed as quickly, so you're not going to feel anything for a good half hour, 45 minutes. So what happens when we don't feel something and we maybe want to feel it? We're going to consume more, right? So that results in a greater amount of THC being consumed in a shorter period of time, and then after that, 30 minutes to an hour, it hits that person all at once, and it's usually a more intense high that can have a lot more consequences. So these products, specifically usually shown or only sold in states in which recreational marijuana is legal, like Colorado or California example, can have up to 99% THC. Most of these concentrations are at least about that 20%, which again is a lot higher than the marijuana that was smoked by the hippies in the 1960s. That was really the marijuana that kind of chilled people out, had more of that lesser effect on our brain and body. But now with higher levels of THC, we're seeing that there is a greater risk for experiencing that psychosis, that panic, because of the strong effect that really high concentration of THC has on our amygdala. And it's actually kind of sad to note, but there have been a few deaths in young users. Sometimes people say, well, no one has died from marijuana use, but maybe most people just don't know about this, because these aren't the stories that are in the news. But there are actually a few reports of young people who had intense panic and died. So there was an example of a young person who had such an intense panic attack that he actually jumped off a building. And then there were 2 other young teens who experienced psychosis and some hallucinations, and they were really freaked out and they actually stabbed themselves. So these are really kind of scary examples, and we don't use them as a scare tactic, like, don't use marijuana or you'll die. But this was really kind of a strong thing for people to look at, researchers and teachers and medical professionals in the fields, to just say, wow, we didn't really realize that marijuana could do this, that the cannabis plant could have these effects. but in these high levels, it acts like a hallucinogenic drug. Again, it can be stimulant and a depressant. Its effects are just so unpredictable and can be really more serious when we maybe use an edible with high THC. Next, we're going to talk about dabbing. So dabbing is the act of using marijuana through an electronic nicotine delivery system or device, or a vaping device. Now, in the name, we would assume that you're usually using nicotine, but these vaping devices, or what we call ends, can actually be filled with any substance, and often they're filled with these THC concentrates or oils. So these oils can be a solid, a liquid, an oily concentration, something sharp like shatter, and they have all sorts of different names that don't really sound like marijuana or cannabis. We might not associate it with that drug. If we just heard this, we might not really understand what it is. For example, they have names like butter, honey, nectar, amber, butane hash oil, essential oil, snake tails, just to name a few. And as you can see in the photo, they can have all different hues and shades and different textures. They can look like a lot of different things. But just like edibles, these have very high levels of THC. And many clients who dab have reported that they have had some of those psychotic symptoms, such as hallucinations or delusional thoughts, and even some young users seizuring out because of the strong effect that high level of THC has. So again, CBD, when it's used as a medicine, can maybe help with seizures and epilepsy, but what we're finding is THC concentrates and oils and high levels can actually cause seizures. So this is another way that this drug and this substance can be really confusing because of the array of effects it can have on people. This slide shows some more of those cannabis or marijuana concentrates, some of the other names and things they can look like. And as you can see, the names vary, the textures vary, the colors vary, and a lot of these things don't even put off an odor. So they don't have that strong skunky smell we might usually associate with marijuana. And when it's used in a vaping device, you can add other oils. So people might not even realize that someone is using marijuana or THC when they're using these concentrates. It's a great way to kind of conceal use. So it's something to really look out with a young person or someone who maybe shouldn't be using the drug and is trying to conceal it. Now, because marijuana is being used increasingly within our country, over the world, there's really a whole culture that has been created around using the substance. People don't always just use it for the effect that it has on their body, but this whole culture, again, that has been created. So there is maybe that idea that cannabis or marijuana is safer than other drugs that are legal, like alcohol. So we'll see some advertisements like this one here, alcohol kills, cannabis chills. But drugs, comparing drugs is really like comparing apples to oranges. They'll have differences, and in one way, one drug might be slightly safer on that specific action or effect on our body, but it might be worse for our body in another way. So we can't really make those comparisons that it's better or worse than a substance. We just were here to promote really the risks that we do know based on the research. But getting into some of these other brands, Kush Supply Co., Bubba Kush Brands, and No Bad Ideas are just a couple of brands that promote marijuana use and promote hiding that drug use. Because again, in our federal government, it's still illegal. In many states, it's still illegal. So these hats here actually have little stash pockets inside to hide your drugs. And you wouldn't even think that that would be related to a drug at all, right? That No Bad Idea, you can see we just circled, there's just a little crown there. It doesn't look like a marijuana leaf or a substance like some of those ads have. So you might not even know that it's drug paraphernalia. So we just show this because in today's culture, there might be a lot more drug references that are kind of right under our nose, and we might not even realize it just because it has become so popular to promote this drug culture.
So because we're talking about the adolescence and brain development, we cannot leave this presentation without talking about addiction. Knowing and understanding addiction is very important, and according to NIDA, addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use, despite the harmful consequences. Some possible consequences of use that were mentioned earlier were things like academic consequences, so not finishing high school or not even enrolling into higher education like college, or there's even financial consequences. And even past those two things, there's many more, such as emotional consequences, or your emotional health can be in jeopardy, your legal consequences, and like Trish was saying previously, because we know that it's still illegal in many states, and it's still illegal in our federal government. And then also your social health. All of these things can be impacted by the use of marijuana and THC. Addiction really changes brain chemistry. It replaces a person's normal priorities with new priorities based on the need to use the drug or obtain the drug. And we see that a lot, and that's not just with marijuana, but that's with any kind of addiction. So earlier we looked at the structures of the brain that are affected by THC. One of those that we'll bring back up is the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is responsible for our reward system in the body. Now, as a part of this reward system, there's a natural neurotransmitter that is released called dopamine. Now, dopamine it causes that pleasurable feeling, or a high or euphoric feeling. And again, it can be released naturally through doing different things like hanging out with friends, eating your favorite foods. For me, it's pizza. Laughing, working out. Those are all natural ways for us to release this dopamine, or that feel-good neurotransmitter. Now, when THC is present, it actually forces this chemical to be released. And the more that this chemical is being released, the more the user is likely to continue to use the drug. Eventually, with heavy use, it can lead to addiction. Now, according to NIDA, people who begin using marijuana before the age of 18 are 4 to 7 times more likely to develop a marijuana use disorder than adults are. And again, we know that that is because of that brain development piece. Since the adolescent brain and those structures are still developing, using substances such as marijuana increase the risk of addiction. So let's take a look at two types of addiction. First, we'll talk about physical addiction, and then we'll talk about psychological addiction. So physical addiction, when someone is physically addicted to a drug, it actually changes the physiology of the brain. The core part of the brain, which is the brainstem, this is like our survival indicator. Its normal function is to send us signals that, we need food, we need water, we need shelter. However, when someone is physically addicted to a drug, it actually changes these priorities in this part of the brain. So now it's no longer food, water, and shelter, but it's food, water, shelter, and the drug. It seems like it's such an important part of that person that they feel that they need it just to function normally. And without it, they have very uncomfortable withdrawal symptoms. And withdrawal, as you can see here, is defined as the body's way of communicating a craving for the drug. And the frontal cortex, which helps us with making our decisions, is impaired when someone is using marijuana or using a drug with this physical addiction. So now the user might make risky decisions, such as stealing to support their use. It can go from stealing from family members to stealing from friends. The possibilities are really endless. And we see that in brain imaging studies of people with addiction. It actually shows that physical changes in this area that are crucial to judgment, decision making, learning, and memory. A lot of the things that we said before. These changes help to explain really the compulsive nature of addiction. And when talking about that physical addiction, there's a couple things that we really want to talk about. One of those things being tolerance. So tolerance is when the body gets so used to using a drug that it needs that drug more to produce the same effect. So it's almost like they chase the high. And that's what this image here is showing us. So we see that on this image, there's that middle baseline feeling. And when someone uses drugs for the first couple of times, they experience a high. a high, and as that drug leaves their body, then they go back to that normal baseline feeling. Now, if they are developing a tolerance, the more and more that they use it, they're going to need more of that drug to try to chase that first high. And when they don't get that first high, then that is where the possibility of an overdose can happen. Now, there's different studies on if someone can overdose on marijuana or THC or not, but this is not just related to marijuana, but this tolerance happens with a bunch of drugs. Pretty much all drugs, you experience a tolerance. So when that person is experiencing this tolerance and they no longer have that substance in their body, what happens is they go from feeling that really high to feeling a really low. And it's almost like if they don't have that substance on them, then they can't function normally, and that's where we start to see a dependence. So the next type of addiction that we'll talk about is psychological addiction. And this type of addiction really affects a person's mental health, where the person begins to feel anxious or they may even feel depressed, which can lead to the user feeling like they need to use that drug to cope with their symptoms that they're experiencing. And sometimes this type of addiction can be seen as less important or prominent, but really it's so important to acknowledge and be aware of psychological addiction. It's more common with marijuana use, and it's becoming more and more common with marijuana use. As we'll see, as Trish mentioned before, the THC levels are increasing. It's not the same as it was when it was in the 80s, where it was a very small percentage, but now we're actually seeing that it can get to about 20% to even 99% THC in some of these products. And we know that THC is a psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. So, and psychoactive meaning that it affects the brain. So although physical addiction is becoming more and more common with marijuana users, there has been an increase in physical addiction as well, especially in states like Colorado, where again the high THC levels are legal. Now, when we look at this chart here, it shows the correlation or the relationship between mood and anxiety disorder amongst the respondents with marijuana dependence. So what this is showing is actually that users with a marijuana dependence are more likely to have an anxiety or mood disorder. Now again, we don't necessarily know if the use of marijuana is causing these mood and anxiety disorders, but there's definitely a correlation between the two. So there's a myth or a belief that marijuana is not addictive, but this chart actually shows otherwise. So let's take a look at this. So it says substance use disorder in the past year among adults aged 18 and older by selected types of substances. And we can see down at the bottom, the red is marijuana, the blue is prescription pain relievers, green is cocaine, and it looks like orange is heroin. And we can see that in 2014, 3.5 million adults aged 18 or older had a past year substance use disorder related to their marijuana use. This is about 1.5% of adults. Okay, so the belief that's out there that you can't get addicted to marijuana, we actually see that you can, and it's actually more prevalent than those other substances that we see listed here.
Lastly, we will be looking at the social norms surrounding marijuana use. So the social norms approach is really focusing on healthy behaviors and positive attitudes, not just the unhealthy things or what is really common in a group, because oftentimes people think that maybe everybody participates in those unhealthy behaviors like drug use or everybody does it, and that just isn't true. What we find is most common is that only a small minority are using and the majority don't use. So we get this data from the Monitoring the Future survey that has been recording or measuring drug and alcohol use among adolescents nationwide back since 1975. And overall, 482 students from 390 public and private schools participated in the 2018 Monitoring the Future survey. This survey is funded by NIDA, a component of the National Institute of Health, and conducted by the University of Michigan. So what they found in 2018 is that only 5.8% of 12th graders used marijuana daily. 3.4% of 10th graders use marijuana daily, and only 0.7% of 8th graders across the whole country used marijuana daily. So this really shows that not everybody does it. That is actually really a small minority of students in those grades that actually used marijuana on a daily basis. So we again show this to promote those healthy attitudes, really kind of that healthier perspective that not everybody does it, so I don't have to do it too. It's really maybe not as common as people might think. To review some of our objectives for our training today, we looked at the different components of marijuana, THC and CBD, and how that concentration or the potency of THC has changed over time and the implications of that, as well as the use of CBD for medicine. We also looked at the neural and behavioral risks associated with use, especially in adolescents because of their brain not developing quite yet, and the different parts of the brain that are impaired by marijuana use, and the consequences of that. Lastly, we looked at the two different types of addiction and how they're more likely to happen in adolescents because of their brain development and the implications of that. Here are some of our references that we used for the information within our slides today, where we pulled our studies from and our research from. Here are our video and photo references for everything within our slides. And lastly, we'll leave you with our contact information at Prevention Works, again, formerly known as CASIC. We have offices both in Jamestown and Dunkirk within Chautauqua County. Eric and I's email addresses are down here at the bottom. And lastly, if you would like credit for this and you would like to get a certificate, please don't forget to complete the 5-question multiple choice quiz to get that. Thank you for joining us.